I have been studying the zone location data for over 60,000 games of Chapter 3 Fortnite, and I've found some revolutionary things that are going to help you to predict zones and make your friends think that you have zone hacks. We're going to talk about which corner of the map has more zones than any other, how to position yourself within each zone to get the next one, and I even found a large area of the map which literally cannot have a zone in it. Before we start, I'll mention that no differences were found between the zones of different regions, rounds and tournaments. Epic does use exactly the same zone logic for every game. This first video in the series covers the first two zones only, so everything here applies to pubs, arena and tournament games. Let's start with the first zone. This is a very large zone, and I'm sure you've noticed that sometimes it's very central like this, and other times it's nearer the edge of the map like these ones, and you might have to go far to get to them. Here is the centre point of the first zones for 60,000 games, which you will see makes a really neat circular pattern. You might notice an empty patch in the southeast, but we'll get back to that in a bit, as first zone is not the time to worry about it. A zone with its centre on the edge of this region will look something like this. So the whole map is covered, it's just that the centres of the zones have to be nearer the middle of the map to prevent the first zone from being half off the map. There was a regular rumour in Chapter 2 that southeast zones were more common than anything, and barely any games finished in Coral Castle. Now I checked that and found that this was true, but there's no need to worry about that now, so how about on the Chapter 3 map? Turns out that it is the opposite effect. North and west zones are more likely than south and east. The reason for this is basically that there is plenty of land there, and the southeast corner has that weird restricted area that we touched on before. Now let's consider your chances of getting first zone. Firstly, let's draw all the extreme far zones, and we'll notice something interesting. There's actually an area in the middle of the map that literally cannot be outside the first zone, and here it is. If you want to have first zone in every game, this is where you should be. Obviously this is a little stupid as you probably want to loot somewhere better, but it's nice to know that this is always a safe area. But what about your chances in every other area of the map? Here's a contour diagram for the whole map of the chance that you're in first zone. As expected, we see the small central area with a 100% chance of being in the first zone, and as you go outwards, the probability gets smaller. Hopefully it's quite logical to you why this is. And here are the chances of pulling first zone for some popular spots. Unsurprisingly, Tilted and Coney are the highest two, as they are the most central places. In the middle we have places like Rocky, Command Cavern and Greasy, and the worst places for zone are mostly in the south and east, especially Condo Canyon. If you aren't landing at one of these places, you can pause the video and read your approximate value using the contours. I'd also like to point out this area, where the 80% contour line is extended rather wide into Tilted. Most statisticians would point out that this is just because there's a slight bias towards west zones, but given that RNG Benji Fishy is landing there at the moment, I'm going to call it the Benji bump. Let's recap the most important points so far. The nearer you are to the centre of the map, the higher your chance of getting first zone, and it can make a huge difference, with edge map down to around 20% chance and centre map anything up to 100. This doesn't mean that you need to land centre, because first zone rotations are often very simple, but you'll have to be prepared to loot fast and rotate early if you are likely to get some far ones. There is also a bias towards north and west zones that you can take into account a little bit. Moving on to the second zone. Let's see the overall chances of getting second zone for each location on the map. Here the north and west bias that I showed during first zone is seen a bit clearer, with the map centering not far from Loot Lake. And here are the chances of the POIs being in second zone. As expected, the central locations once again have the best chance, but nowhere has more than about 20%. In most games you'll be moving for second zone no matter where you land. Down at the bottom, we have Condo Canyon again, where you have 4% chance, and you would be super lucky to be in a second zone in any game. Here is the distribution of centre points of the second zones. You can see that the circle bounding the second zone centres is wide enough to cover almost the whole map. And as these are only the centres of the zones, the whole map is covered by possible zones. There are some areas that are actively avoided. For example, the centre of zone will never be in these areas of water. The far more glaring thing here is the huge blank area in the southeast of the map. There are literally no zones that centre on that area out of the 60,000 games that I looked at. Now these areas can be in the second zone because these are only the centres of zones being plotted. So showing a few zones here, here and here demonstrates that every area can still be covered, but it is a bit less likely that it will be in zone, and this becomes a much bigger factor in later zones. There's also a small strip near Greasy that cannot get a zone centre. Again, we will revisit it later. Why these strange areas exist, I do not know. Perhaps something special is planned for that area of the map, or maybe it's a bug in Epic's code. The dead spot does create a weird situation though, where you can predict some of the second zones accurately. Going back to all the first zone centres, let's take all of these ones in the southeast. And now let's see where all the second zones were. Notice that every single one pulled far southeast, no exceptions in the 2,000 games shown here. Because there aren't any zones allowed in that area north of Kondo, all the zones have to pull super far over to the edge of the map. So if you get a first zone that looks something like this, you know with 100% certainty that it will pull far like this. This first zone happens around 1 in 30 games, which may not sound like much, but that's a game in every 3 tournaments that you're going to be 100% certain about where the second zone is. Now let's explore where second zones go generally. The most common rumour about second zones is that when you get a first zone towards the edge of the map, then the second zone always keeps pulling far that way. I investigated whether this was true, and I found that it does have quite a lot of truth to it, so let me explain. Let's go back to first zones and just take the ones that pull far. They make up 30% of all first zones. And here are the centres of second zones for those first zones. You can see that more of them do go further outwards, but some do come back inwards. Let's summarise and put numbers on these things with the help of an example first zone. I divided the second zone into 4 types. You have a zone that pulls back sharply towards the centre, one that pulls back a little bit, one that goes kind of far, and then the last type that go very, very far. Now the percentage that are of each type, you have 5% pulling back sharply towards the centre of the map, 10% not so far, 22% quite far, and a huge 63% are a max pull second zone. The 22 plus 63% gives 85% of them going further outwards, which means only 15% of these come back towards the centre of the map. Now why is this? Are Epic just a bunch of sadists who want to see every player suffer? Not quite. It's a little complicated to explain well, but I will try. The priority for Epic's zone choices is for later zones to be fairly evenly distributed over the map, and Epic's code then chooses the zones backwards from there. If the second zone is edge map, then you can't have the first zone also centered on the edge of the map, otherwise it would just be a ridiculous first zone. Therefore first zone goes as far as it is allowed to, which is sort of halfway towards the edge of the map. This means that whenever you see that far first zone, it is often because the later zones are far and therefore the first zone was forced to be as far as it could be. This creates the situation where max first zones often lead to max second zones. If you didn't understand that, my apologies, but I've done my best. All you really need to know is that far first zones do usually give far second zones, but not always. We've seen a few ways to guess where the zone might go, and one situation where you can predict it perfectly. But in general, is there a way to know you're in second zone before it appears? There kind of is a way to do this. Because second zone is exactly half the diameter of first zone, the very centre of the first zone will always be inside the second zone, or at least on the very edge of it. Here's an example first zone, and I've added all the extreme second zones to it. As you see, the centre point cannot be outside the second zone. It is impractical to always sit directly in the middle of zone, but as long as you're close to the centre, you're very likely to get zone. And when you don't, you will never need to go far. This actually applies to the third and fourth zones too, as they are all half the diameter of their predecessors. However, as I demonstrated earlier, you may want to expect a slightly far pull if first zone is not central. Well, that's all for this video on first and second zones. I hope you found that really useful, and I'll be releasing part 2 next week, which will cover third zone to the end of the game. This will explain more about the restricted southeast zone, how to position yourself for fifth zone, how likely water zones are, and loads more like that. Please do subscribe and let me know if there is something in particular that you want to know so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, see you next time.